I had intended to talk about the other modules and how they all fit together this week, but I decided to put that off because I wasn't able to get a mock-up of the next module interface finished this week, and so I can't demonstrate it yet. I spent an unreasonable amount of time getting the starting menus to work this week. There are a lot of interactions between the card selection buttons, and it took several days to get them working right and feeling good. I also finally took the time this week to get the game soundtrack settled, and that was a major achievement. In a previous game I made, I used a very energetic soundtrack to emulate the cocaine-fueled frantic energy that I assume underlies most business management decisions. I like this artist, and I've been using his music for the backdrop of my devlogs so far. When I tried out some of his songs with Falling as Lightning, they just didn't quite fit the gameplay or mood that I'm going for. The gameplay is more deliberative than my last game, and so I wanted music with a more reflective feel. Music that sits in the background without driving the gameplay. I also wanted to cultivate a melancholy, morose feeling, which I think is suitable for a game that's taking place on the backdrop of a civil war that's tearing a state apart and that nobody really wants to be fighting. I think this music captured that mood very nicely. I found this on Free Music Archive, which has a huge collection. You have to make sure that there's an open license before you put anyone's music in a project that you want to sell, which is the type of license that Unheard had. I wanted a different jazzy music theme for the other modules where you are interacting with the factions, and this music by Til Paradiso was spot on. They didn't have an open license, but I sent them a very short email explaining my situation, and they immediately got back to me and gave me permission to use their music. Really, it never hurts to ask if you find someone's stuff that you like. Settling away the music, however, led me to an unexpected problem. The sound effects I had been using for the game were fine on a silent background, but some of them were a little too complex to fit in with the musical background. So now I need to go back to the drawing board and harmonize the sounds better again. The other thing I spent a big chunk of the week working on was getting a first pass on the translations for the card module finished, and oh boy, did I have some epiphanies. The first thing I realized was that it's really hard to translate into a language you don't speak. Shocking, I know. I worked my way around that to some extent, with a lot of work. Translating into French, Korean, and Russian wasn't too much of a problem for me, though I did have trouble with certain words like dismiss, which could be translated in different ways. I then sent the French translations through an online translator to get texts for Spanish and Portuguese, which are part of the Romance family with French. I used Wikipedia articles for things like light tank to get the correct word for a light scout. I had to manually check the translations, of course, and that's what took a lot of time. I just used English as a base for the German translations, and that worked out okay. Asian languages are a little complicated to explain, but their vocabulary is often phonetically very similar, even if the character glyphs look different. Because of this, if a word has a common source in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, the three glyphs will match up, even if they look very different. For the Asian languages, I just sent my Korean translations through an online translator. Of course, I couldn't check these translations easily, so I'm sure there's a lot of mistakes, but I think the game is now at a point of minimum usability in Chinese and Japanese. A major mistake that I made when doing the translation was not keeping a list of standardized words. For example, drawing a card is called summoning an advisor, but the word for summon could get translated in various ways by an online translator. It's important for the vocabulary to be standardized so that the player understands what effects a card will have, and if the word summoned is translated one way in one sentence and differently in a different sentence, that can be very confusing. So standardizing the vocabulary for the languages that I don't speak involved a lot of scrolling up to check how a word had been previously translated. I do have an array of a few key terms, but these can only be used with words that don't appear in sentences because of the different grammar rules in different languages. And, like I said last time, in general, full sentences are your friend when localizing. Oops, that needs to be a ya, not an ah. I said last week that I think you should not wait too long before preparing for localization, and I still think that's true. Making sure everything will adapt easily saves a lot of time in the long run. After doing translation work this week, however, I have one addendum. I think that you shouldn't start translating too early. I waited until the card module was mostly wrapped up before I started to translate, and even this I think might have been a little bit too soon. Now that I've translated everything into the 9 languages, if I want to change something, or if I even want to just add a little note, I have to do that not just for English, but for all 9 languages. That can add to the complexity, and it can also just be a little bit of a motivation killer. So that's a little bit more of a problem than I anticipated. Anyway, that's all for this week. Thanks for watching.